Chapter 6. Temporary Freedom and a Third Trial. After the second trial, the court granted Leslie the right to release on bail. Thanks to friends who mortgaged their homes to come up with $20,000, on December 27, 1977, Leslie was freed on a $200,000 bond. She would be free until and for the duration of the third trial. She remained out of jail for over 6 months until July 1978. During those months, together with her family and other friends, I accompanied Leslie through moments of culture shock and easy homecoming as she ventured back into the world. We visited each other's family homes. We relaxed with friends. We talked about the future. Where would she go if released? Would she change her name? Free on bail. Just before the 1978 New Year holiday, Leslie celebrated her freedom by going to the beach with her mother and friends. Later that week, at the apartment of her friend since high school, Linda Grippy, we chatted late into the night. Leslie was excited about all she had to do and all the possibilities. She had talked about using an alias, but decided against it. Getting released from the jail had been a whirlwind event, and she hadn't yet had time to write in her diary. She needed to get centered. She couldn't sleep. She was suffering anxiety, her mind busy with all the challenges and responsibilities she faced. She was still carrying the feeling of no way out of my confinement, and yet she was out, if only temporarily. As tangible freedom began to sink in, she said, "I'm not full of super dreams. I love ironing, the smell of fresh clothes, walks down a sidewalk." Her primary concern was for her mother, who feared for Leslie's safety. She wanted to avoid attracting media attention and was equipped with scarves and dark glasses for anonymity if she felt the need. She was feeling the pressures and said, "It would have been easier to go back to prison. Or I could just stay in this apartment and hide until court starts. But I need time for myself, and I need time with people I love." She knew it was a major breakthrough for her to be released. It enabled her to test the waters. She said, "I'm out. The pattern's broken. The big taboo, releasing any former Manson associate. There hasn't been any big fear campaign. No threats." Leslie lived a very normal life for over 6 months. She went to work as a legal secretary, or when court was in session, to trial every day. She visited family and friends on occasional evenings and took short trips on long weekends. She was never accosted by the media, or, to her knowledge, recognized by strangers. The week of Leslie's release, a group of her friends, including her lawyer Max Keith, and those who helped raise the bail, gathered for low-key Scrabble and pizza. We were all accustomed to seeing her in jail and prison, so were quietly affected by her presence in our midst. I gave Leslie her first scary ride in 8 years in LA freeway traffic. It was rush hour, there was a driving rainstorm, and I was driving a borrowed sports car. I'm a poor driver. We were both terrified, and Leslie asked me to concentrate on the road, which was barely visible. Suddenly, the sun burst through the sky. The rain stopped, and everything was crystal clear and glistening, even the buildings. Leslie said quietly in wonder, "I hope I never forget how everything looks to me today." A group of my friends in Echo Park organized a discreet party for Leslie to let her know that women can be there for each other, even when someone does something beyond the pale. Her hosts, Sue and Lieb, and many of the guests, had followed her second trial. A few had known her through the Santa Cruz Women's Prison Project in the prison. Others were simply curious about her. Once they met her, everyone engaged her in conversation out of genuine interest in her situation, and she reciprocated. Leslie put everyone at ease, although she was concerned beforehand, because, as she put it, parties are lonely. We went together to a supermarket, and Leslie was overwhelmed by the crowds and the noise. When we were in line and the bell rang on the cash register, Leslie jumped in fright. To her, for an instant, it was an echo of the beeper in the jail. Later, within the safety of Linda's apartment, with the tape recorder on January 3rd, 1978, she talked agitatedly about lockup noises. I'm used to sleeping through beepers, clanging doors, the sounds of the drunks in and out, people yelling, going through DTs, the sounds from the ward right across from me, of people who have lost their minds, people yelling for cigarettes or coffee, keys going jingle-jangle non-stop, doors crashing at every exit from or entry into a cage, the beeper system, the intercom, everything repeated twice, like Deputy Jones 1021. Deputy Jones 1021 or 3042-52, line up and proceed to the dining room. 3042-52, line up and proceed to the dining room. The beeper system reaches everywhere. It sounds like those new cash registers that beep. Sometimes I could block out the constant beeping, but if it was a bad day and I tuned in to every sound, I would lose my mind. Some officers were always making banging sounds with their sticks to provoke us. Talking late another night, Leslie's thoughts were centered on the prison and jail in which she had, by 1978, spent more than 8 years. These were the people she knew, the relationships that mattered to her, the routines and constraints that ordered her daily life. From time to time, she would stop her train of thought and realize with wonder that she was, at least temporarily, free. In her stream of consciousness chatter, she said she looked forward to writing to her friends in prison about having keys both to Linda's apartment and to the borrowed car. 2 keys. Her mind was racing. She worried about someone breaking into the borrowed car. She expressed concern about her weight, saying, "I'm getting that Ripley stuff." I commented on how she had touched and brought people together from many different worlds who are interested in her case, and she considered it. Differences fascinate me. I like to know their reasoning, their thinking. Leslie reflected on how weird it was that a bail bond and set of keys can make such a difference in worlds. Like tonight when we drove past the jail, knowing they're all in there in their little cages. It doesn't seem so far away, that building on a hill by the freeway. But inside the building is a warped world. I went with her to her mother's home, and they glowed with each other in open, loving, unconditional acceptance. Later, Leslie's younger sister, younger brother, and his wife arrived. They were alternately lively and shyly affectionate, dressed up with the respect for the reunion occasion. They showed pride in one another, including Leslie, who, I think, symbolizes courage to them. At the same time, they despised what she did and how it directly affected so many lives, including their own. She was at ease. Everyone was disbelieving that the crime had happened, that Leslie had been in prison for more than 8 years, that she was now at home with her mother and her family. We drove north and visited her older brother and his wife. They all talked a mile a minute about family, jobs, social issues, artistic projects, nutrition, the plants that filled their sunny apartment. They spoke with affection of their father and of the ways their parents continued to show respect for each other despite the divorce. It was as if Leslie had been away on a long journey. One could see her sadness fleetingly recede in the warmth being tendered by people to whom she belonged. In San Francisco, mutual friends, women and men who came to the prison as tutors, had a gathering. Hosted by Bill Moore, a scholar and community activist, and his wife Andrea, who taught art in the prison, it was a welcoming reunion. Bill had been a major influence on Leslie's study of African American history. He'd taught her about Malcolm X. He helped her recognize the folly of thinking that black people would unequivocally defeat white people in a war. He had educated her, and Pat and Susan, to the racist errors in Manson's illogic. With Bill, Andrea, Catherine Cusick, Deborah Miller, and other friends Leslie had made through the Santa Cruz Project, we reminisced about our school days. We laughed at our various instances of awkwardness in the beginning and contemplated some of the lessons we'd learned together. Gina was a friend of mine in Sonoma County in Northern California, where I relocated from Los Angeles shortly after the end of the second trial. Gino knew Leslie because they had been in prison together at CIW in 1976, before Gino's release and Leslie's transfer to Sybil Brand. The three of us sat together in front of the fire in the converted water tower where I lived. The two of them got caught up on all the news about old friends from the joint, who got released, who got married, who got busted again, who was strung out. Some make it, some don't. No judgments. They talked about weight and appearance. Leslie had gained 20 pounds since her anorexia, but was still very slender and well-muscled from working out. Gino, even more muscled, complained about how uncomfortable she felt when someone casually introduced her as someone who had been in prison. She told Leslie about a Santa Cruz conference on alternatives to prison, with a lot of ex-prisoners in attendance. Leslie laughingly related to Gino her memory of when I first came into the old death row. "Hi, I'm here to teach women's lib." I feigned a pout. They laughed. Gino and I found ourselves just staring at Leslie, amazed that she was there with us. Leslie's first long-distance phone call as a free citizen was to her former job supervisor in the prison. They commiserated about the uncertainty of her future. From what I heard at our end, it seemed her boss was encouraging her positive thinking about chances and the upcoming third trial. She asked about his wife and new baby. Before hanging up, she said to him, "I don't want to lose your friendship. You're a friend." Driving to the beach, Leslie exulted at the sight of sheep and horses in meadows nestled in the green rolling hills. She said people looked tall to her. We stood together on a low cliff above a tumultuous ocean in a storm, tears rolling down her cheeks, reacting to the power, freedom, and eternity of the sea. Having grown up with it, she missed seeing the ocean for more than 8 years. Massive crashing waves sent off sprays of salt water, which splashed onto our faces and mingled with the rain and Leslie's silent, salty tears. Back in Southern California at McCabe's, a popular Santa Monica folk club, Leslie heard Chris Williamson sing her song, Native Dancer, with the lyrics. Just a situation with 4 walls and a floor. She stared at the ceiling. She longed for the door. Strange lands and separation, so far from home. And so far, she's holding her own. Leslie had first met Chris in the Special Security Unit 6 years before, when Chris came in to sing for the women there. 2 years before the McCabe's reunion, Chris had given Leslie the lyrics to Native Dancer, which described Leslie's situation and that of anyone trapped by circumstance. Now, there she was, experiencing the song amidst a crowd in the free world, Chris's music creating a comforting ambience far from the tensions of the prison. One day I asked Leslie what she most liked about the world, seeing it as she was for the first time in years. She said, me being in it. She was calm now, grateful to be alive, not taking it for granted. The months on bail were healing to Leslie. Despite the pressure of the trial and the need to evade the media outside court, Leslie appeared to adjust quickly to the absence of prison discipline and surveillance. With friends and family in reach, she created a quiet, private life and maintained her equilibrium. In conversation one day in the car, she reflected on how her prison mates expected to hear from her about how weird it is out here, how strange, foreign, and outer spacey. But driving through those fields, it doesn't seem like 9 years since I traveled that road, with the eucalyptus protecting the crops from the wind. There aren't enough hours. Days are too short. Third trial. The third trial began in March 1978 in the court of Judge Gordon Ringer. Disappointed at the outcome of the second trial, Stephen K. changed his strategy for the third. He focused on the fact that food, clothing, coins, and a wallet had been taken from the LaBianca home. Technically, this made felony robbery an additional motive for the murders. Unbeknownst to Pat and Leslie, Manson had taken a wallet before he sent his team into the house. But robbery was certainly not on their minds. The wallet was left intact as a decoy in a service station bathroom, in what Manson mistakenly believed to be a black neighborhood. Manson intended that the police would assume a black person stole it. According to California state law at the time, a first-degree murder conviction required that the accused's state of mind was capable and culpable of premeditation, deliberation, and harboring malice, and further, that the accused was able to reflect meaningfully and maturely on the gravity of the act. In the second trial, Max Keith had defended Leslie on the grounds of diminished capacity, because she clearly had neither premeditated murder nor acted with deliberation or malice. Indeed, she had shown herself to be incapable of committing murder. Further, her behavior during and following the first trial, like that of her co-defendants, demonstrated that she was then incapable of reflecting in any meaningful or mature way on the seriousness of the murders. Instead of trying Leslie solely on murder in the third trial, as he had in the second, Stephen K. changed the charge to felony murder committed in the act of robbery, a crime for which state of mind was not legally relevant. This was a reversal of the strategy of D.A. Vincent Bugliosi, who, when he led the prosecution in the 1970-71 trial, had stated unequivocally that there had been no evidence of ransacking or robbery. The LaBianca's son testified in that trial that nothing was missing except the few clothes and coins. Bugliosi wanted it understood by the jury that Manson's motive of helter-skelter that made the LaBianca murders part of the so-called crime of the century, singular, not a pedestrian robbery murder. Kay had to settle for less. The law was much less philosophical about murders committed in the course of a robbery, and conviction did not require evidence of malice, deliberation, or premeditation. Even though food, clothing, and coins did not constitute evidence of serious robbery from rooms filled with valuables, adding that charge gave the state the technical authority to convict her of the murder as a first-degree offense. To bolster Kay's efficiency in the courtroom, a second DA, Dino Fugoni, later appointed to a judgeship, was assigned the case to assist with the trial. This particular man was versed in psychology and would be useful when the diminished capacity arguments were raised by a persistent Max Keith. Fulgoni's expertise was used to challenge the psychiatric testimony. The judge, for his part, explicitly instructed the jury to disregard Leslie's state of mind at the time of the crime or in the present. It was no longer relevant. Stephen K. told the press, "I think if I can get a jury that follows the law instead of emotions, I can get a first-degree conviction. Once again, Kay displayed for the jury the enlarged color photos of the murders at the Tate residence, emphasizing his charge that Leslie was part of a conspiracy responsible for both nights of murder. Technically, conspiracy was irrelevant to this third trial because it was a single event of felony murder for which she was now being prosecuted. Thus, the Tate murders were likewise irrelevant. But the state showed a commitment to reconviction, and the strategy succeeded. In the process, the state could sidestep the psychiatrists and other expert witnesses concerning Leslie's state of mind, just as Kay no longer had grounds for the conspiracy theory as it applied to the Tate case. Keith no longer had legal grounds for asserting the diminished capacity defense, but he pushed it nevertheless. Leslie could not have understood the nature of the crime, he argued. Her mind was altered because of the cumulative effects of LSD and Manson's power over her. Keith strove to win a verdict of voluntary manslaughter, which is defined as unlawful killing without malice aforethought. On July 5, 1978, 9 years after the crime, and after 6 months of freedom, bail was pulled and Leslie, now age 28, was returned to court to hear the jury's guilty verdict. She was then taken back to jail to await sentencing. The jury's foreman later told the press that jurors had agreed that Leslie suffered some diminished capacity, but we just could not determine that it was diminished to the extent that was required to relieve her of responsibility of what she had done. The jury's unanimous conviction on 2 counts of first-degree felony murder did not clear up the question of individual responsibility versus cult coercion. The third trial, however, had the effect of officially separating Leslie's case from that of her 3 co-defendants. Legally, she was no longer one of them. Superior Court Judge Gordon Ringer didn't equivocate. He sentenced her to 7 years to life in prison. Given California law in 1978, the new sentence automatically carried with it the possibility of parole after 7 years, which she had already served, and he encouragingly implied that she might well become an early beneficiary of that provision. Leslie had other judicial reasons for hope. The reason in fewer than 10 years of Jean and Linda, her early prison mates in the old death row unit, offered encouragement as Leslie approached 10 years in prison. More important, Leslie was no longer legally a death penalty overturn. For her part in the crime of which she was now convicted, she would not have received the death penalty, even though it was then back in force in California. The conspiracy to murder charge was technically moot in the third trial. In 1971, Kay's then boss, Vincent Bugliosi, has succeeded in convicting Leslie of 7 murders based on conspiracy. In 1977 and 78, it took 2 juries and a severely compromised strategy on Kay's part to convict her of 2 of them. She was now officially separated from her association with Helter Skelter. The question of retribution. I think it is disrespectful towards murder victims and their loved ones to quibble about the seriousness of any given murder. Prosecutors and the media are fond of ranking first-degree murder cases as bad, worse, and worst. In court during the second trial, Stephen Kay repeatedly declared the Manson crimes to be the most cruel and vicious murders in the bloody history of American crime. The media agreed. It routinely spotlighted one or another former member of the Manson family and referred to the crime of the century. The following are among some other horrible crimes that occurred in California through the 1970s and into the 80s. A man was found guilty of the rape and murder of 14 young women. Another predator sadist was convicted of raping and murdering several young women, with the collusion of his submissive wife under the threat to her own life. She did finally call the police and received immunity for her testimony. More than 40 boys were assaulted and murdered, and their bodies dumped in ditches alongside Southern California highways. A man went on a rampage in a nursing home and raped an elderly blind woman. Dan White killed San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and gay activist and city supervisor Harvey Milk in cold blood, with intent. But his charge was reduced to manslaughter owing to his Twinkie defense. He claimed that low blood sugar caused his irrationality. The Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis were overtly committing and encouraging violence against African Americans, Jews, gays, and lesbians. A young white woman in a Northern California suburb strangled a black boy to death because she said something told her she was supposed to kill a nigger. To hold up Manson, the head of his family, as the worst perpetrator of all is to give him too much credit. His predatory contemporaries were no less cruel or vicious. For many years, Stephen Kay has routinely, by his own choice, attended parole hearings for those connected to Manson's crimes, traveling the state from one prison to another for that purpose, each time reiterating his plea to the board to withhold release. To buttress his cause, he enlisted the support of Sharon Tate's now-deceased mother, Doris, and her sister Patty, his neighbors in a comfortable Los Angeles neighborhood. The Tates gathered tens of thousands of signatures, opposing parole for any of the former Manson disciples. In the past few years, he has similarly harnessed the unrelenting grief and anger of some of Lena LaBianca's relatives to campaign against the release of anyone associated with the murders. He has given statements to the National Enquirer, a tabloid paper, to garner public support for his position. At the time of the second and third trials, however, none of the LaBianca family had spoken publicly. The prison system, as we know it, is based on this principle of retribution. But there are families who have lost loved ones to the crime of murder, who focus not on the punishment of the offenders, but rather on the forgiveness, accountability, healing, and reconciliation. These are exceptional people who are highly principled, and most often are people of deep spiritual faith. They seek to avoid living with the debilitating effects of sustained hatred. Instead, they attempt to understand why the perpetrator of the terror inflicted on their loved one could have done such a thing. They will mourn their loss for their lifetime, but they mitigate their own pain through prayer and hard emotional work of finding compassion for the offender within their own hearts. My own attitudes were directly influenced by Herb and Ellie Foster, friends in Santa Cruz, California, whose young adult daughter was brutally murdered by a stranger at the same time that I was getting acquainted with the young women on death row. The Fosters, who were an inspiration to their community, not only found the strength within themselves to carry on without bitterness, they also became adamant critics of the inequities of the criminal justice system. Students of crime and punishment are aware that, apart from pathological crimes of murder, and despite alleged equality under the law, criminal justice systems throughout the Western world selectively criminalize and predominantly incarcerate those who are already marginalized by racism, poverty, and other social and political inequities. The crimes of the wealthy, including profit-motivated corporations, very rarely result in imprisonment. Manufacturers of automobiles or elevators who knowingly make decisions to breach safety regulations when accidental deaths result do not end up in prison. Corporate CEOs whose businesses fail to ensure safe working conditions are not sent to prison when deaths ensue. Owners of mines who shirk on safety and pay for that oversight in mining tragedies do not go to jail. Most commonly, the corporation pays a hefty fine, which they can well afford. And that's the end of the story for all but the survivors. The inequity of the punishment system also extends to much less significant crimes on an individual level. A poor black woman and an affluent white woman may be found guilty of the same offense, such as possession of an illegal drug, but it is the black woman who is much more likely to be sent to prison, while the white woman remains with her family while participating in a community rehabilitation program. These are the kind of issues that informed Herb and Ellie Foster's refusal to succumb to any impulse for vengeance, and instead to successfully struggle to accept their personal tragedy with a loving and compassionate regard for the human condition, together with a commitment to work for social justice. As Quakers, the Fosters were affiliated with a religion that has a long history of seeking equal justice for all and reformation of the worst abuses of penal systems. Thus, not long after their daughter's murder, when the construction of a new and much larger jail was being proposed for their city, they ardently campaigned against it. They were aware that when the number of available jail and prison cells expands, judges quickly fill these new cells with offenders who would have otherwise been granted probation. In this process, people have been increasingly incarcerated for minor offenses, which has led to a burgeoning prison industrial complex in the United States over the past several decades. Given that prisons produce, rather than alleviate violence, the Fosters did not want to collude with this defeatist trend. The contemporary penal abolition movement is energized by many people who, like the Fosters, seek resolution through healing rather than harsh punishment. The above notwithstanding, it is not at all difficult for me to comprehend why other families of murder victims would be disconsolate, preoccupied with their loss, and committed to retributive justice. I don't know that I could be so forgiving myself if I were to lose one of my children, or grandchildren, or anyone I love, because of another person's inability to contain his rage. It is much less obvious, however, why Stephen Kay would have become so apparently obsessed with this case, that it should have played such a central and abiding role in his career. Certainly, media sensationalism brought the Manson crimes before the public's view with an uncommon intensity, and Leslie's retrials brought Stephen Kay into the spotlight. But as I observed him in the courtroom, he wasn't performing for the press so much as he was singularly focused on what appeared to be a personal mission to vanquish any girl who could have been so immoral as to get involved with Manson. One day, when he seemed particularly determined to destroy what remained of Leslie's self-respect, I tried to grasp why he seemed so personally driven in the case. Kay's motive, as he presented himself to the jury, was to make America safe, to rid the country of an evil force. He spoke of Manson's tribe as unique among violent criminals because, in his characterization of Manson and his willing dupes, they were all working together to plot a revolution, and thus were a threat to an entire nation. This was a revolution that Manson thought he could get away with because he and his family would be safely ensconced in a bottomless pit in the desert. I wondered if Manson was flattered to have his preposterous revolutionary scheme taken so seriously by this earnest servant of the establishment. Further, while I didn't doubt the sincerity of Kay's patriotic fervor, his logic didn't fit with Leslie. Having severed her association with Manson several years before, she was not dangerous, according to every expert and by every measure, and he knew that from her records, court testimony, and surely from his own observations. Leslie herself has never suggested an ulterior motive on Kay's part. She has never disparaged him in any way in any conversation with me or tried to analyze his motives. When I was critical of his hostile treatment of her in court and in later parole hearings, she defended him. Leslie has great respect for the law, having trained as a legal secretary. He was, she said, just doing his job. After all, he was not on trial. I, too, don't wish to be unfair to him, but I believe it is responsible to ask why he has pursued this case so diligently and perseveringly for such a long time. During Leslie's second and third trials in 1977 and 1978, when she was approaching age 30, Kay repeatedly said to the court and to the press that he was committed to seeing her remain in prison until she reached age 40. This consonant was Bugliosi's prediction in 1971 that the girls would remain in prison for 15 to 20 years, substantially beyond the then average of 10 to 12 years for serious homicide. Had Leslie been released in 1989, at age 40, she would have fulfilled both prosecutors' harshest suggested sentence, 20 years. But in early 2001, she is 51, and she is still in prison. And Kay, who appears at each parole hearing, has changed his tune. Now, at her hearings, he says that she should never be paroled. As I and anyone who knows her view it, Leslie has been thoroughly rehabilitated. As for Stephen Kay, one would think that by now he would be weary of this battle, so bravely fought almost single-handedly, and would be moving on to other priorities. Meanwhile, I do understand that, whatever his reasons for holding on, it is not my place to judge him. When I described to Ann Neer the ways Kay impressed me, she replied, "What you are searching for is what we need to know. How can we hear Leslie's story and not be the judge? Judgment is mine, saith the Lord, and yet we have an irrepressible tendency to be judgmental. Perhaps it starts through a childhood attempt to know ourselves. We define ourselves at other people's expense. I don't want to be like my mom or my brother. It becomes a function of growing up. Maybe we start being judgmental right in our own families." And I agreed that, in her words, revolution must not lead away from, but rather toward simple trust between people. No matter how profoundly you reach to articulate the need to be judgmental towards each other, you still do not wish to live in a world where it's okay to go rob or otherwise harm your neighbor. Judgments rob innocent and guilty alike of their dignity and their sense of safety and belonging. But who could not judge the actions of the young people who attempted murder at the behest of Charles Manson? I learned a lesson from Leslie, from other women formerly associated with Manson, and from other women in prison who had been convicted of first-degree murder. Namely, a deed must always be the responsibility of the perpetrator, assuming intention and sanity. But the character of the perpetrator is not always reflected in the deed. It doesn't define her. It's not who she is. The women involved with Manson were committed to a world without racism, war, or violence of any kind. They were each highly idealistic. A person of authentically strong ethical character who loses her mind in some way may commit a heinous action without recognizing anything wrong at the time. Later, she may not recognize herself in the action or in the belief supporting it. Anne remarked, "It is puzzling that the women involved with Charles Manson could imagine that their act of killing could call forth anything good. It's not that they didn't have good teachers. Killing people to keep the peace is common. Besides politicians and the military, the police in some cities employ the practice regularly. Battered women sometimes succumb to that solution. The death penalty is based on the fallacy that if we kill someone who has killed, others will not kill. It is clear from history that this is not the case. Whatever the justifications, and some are no doubt valid or at least understandable, violence ultimately begets only violence." Carrying on. During Leslie's 6-month sojourn into freedom, she contemplated her prison experiences. I asked her one day whether she had ever given up hope for her own future, and she conceded that, yes, she had given up after 7 years in prison, shortly before winning her appeal. She was becoming institutionalized, passive and placid, and was guarded against emotional involvement. You learn your own inadequacies, the insecurities you lay on a person. In 1977, when she was in the Los Angeles jail awaiting retrial, she had the impulse to just drop the case and go back to the state prison. Just lock myself up and forget it forever. It was an impulse in which she couldn't act because so many people love and care for me. You can't help but keep trying to be free, even if you don't stand a chance. You always fight for it. The more attention I get from people truly trying to understand it, the clearer my own perspectives on what happened. Leslie spoke of imprisonment as something I have to go through, need to do. In August 1978, Leslie was returned to the California Institution for Women in Frontera. Early in 2001, she is still there.